All right, we still have people coming in from the lobby, but I think it's 2 minutes past the hour, so we should probably go ahead and get going. Good afternoon and welcome. This is Rocky Mountain Power's public webinar where we're going to share details about our 2023 to 2025 wildfire mitigation plan for the state of Utah. That spells out our efforts to protect our customers in Utah from the threat of wildfire. Guarding against wildfire, which is also known as wildfire mitigation, is one of our top priorities. The Pacific Corp has invested $500 million over the last 5 years in those efforts across our 6-state service area. To share more about what those investments look like on the ground, I'm going to hand it off to Alan Barrett. He's our Rocky Mountain Power's Vice President of Transmission and Distribution Operations. He's going to walk us through some of the efforts in wildfire mitigation that we have planned and that we've already been doing for several years. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Simon. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's just take a look at the agenda. All right, so here's what we're going to be covering. As Simon said, we're going to be going through the wildfire mitigation plan. We're going to be kind of starting off by going through the company's plan development and journey that we've been on since 2018. And we're going to go through the plan elements themselves and kind of touch on each one of them as you see here on the screen. We're going to go and talk about the risk modeling that's identified the areas of heightened fire risk. We're going to talk about situational awareness and what we're doing to monitor that risk on a daily basis. We're going to look at the strategic programs then that kicks off, including system hardening and talking about programs like covered conductor and undergrounding and installation of new equipment. We're also going to touch on public safety power shutoffs and the protocols around that and what that can look like. And then we'll also look at the different customer outreach and education that is a part of the wildfire mitigation plan as well. And so as we go through this, I'm going to be speaking at a pretty high level as we don't have much time together. But if you want more detail than what I'm covering today, I would encourage you to go to Rocky Mountain Power's website, and there you can find the wildfire mitigation plan itself, and you can open it up and look through all the detail, and it'll have more level of detail than what I'll be doing and covering this afternoon. So with that, let's get into it as we transition to the next slide. So here's a little bit, if you look at the top half of this slide, we're looking at the journey we've been on, right? And I say a journey because it goes all the way back to 2018, coming out of California, where we're looking at the wildfire mitigation plan development there. But Pacific Corp took that effort and then took it to the other states we serve. So when we look at Utah, you look at in 2020, where we created our initial wildfire mitigation plan, or WMP, as you'll see it throughout these slides. And then since then, each year, how we've been evaluating that program, growing that program, further developing it, expanding it, and refiling that plan here in 2023, refiled it in 2024 with updated risk modeling and identification of areas of heightened risk in Utah. And that's just been some of our recent plan filing kind of work. But let's talk about what's in that wildfire mitigation plan, right? And I like to break this down into 3 categories. And it starts, if you look at the lower half of the slide, on the left, situational awareness. So this is where we look across the service territory we serve, and we do an analysis of how to identify which areas of the service territory have the highest risk for a catastrophic fire. And so how we do that is we go back and we take a long-term view. So go back 30 years and pull together 30 years worth of weather information, historical wildfires. You look at things of like terrain, is it complex hills and valleys? Is it open plains? You take all this terrain information and you model that with where are the people? Where are the structures, right? So like density, population density. Put that all together to develop a risk model that by taking a long-term view, if I used 30 years of history, where can I predict in the service territory is the highest risk of wildfire? And when I take that long-term view, it's important to realize that I'm not saying that those areas would be the highest probability for a wildfire. It's the model is showing if a fire was to start in those areas for any reason, think lightning, anything else that could cause a fire, that if a fire started in those areas, it has the characteristics in that area for that fire to grow rapidly because it has a history of strong winds or terrain, that allows a fire to spread rapidly, hard to put out as far as access to it and fire suppression. And there's population there that wildfire would be impacting. So all those ingredients together makes it a terrible place to have a fire, possibly leading to a catastrophic wildfire. So it's in those areas that we want to identify so that we can kick off additional operational practices that I'll be talking about. But it's areas that have all the ingredients for if a fire was to be caused for any reason, it has the probability, the potential to turn into a catastrophic wildfire. So we take a long-term view and we identify those areas of our service territory that have those characteristics. And I have a slide later on that will show where that's at, talk about what percentage of our service territory and what we do in those areas. But with situational awareness, that's the long-term view. Now we couple that with a short-term view or a more dynamic seasonal risk modeling. And this is where we have an internal meteorology group that reviews the service territory everywhere across the service territory every day of the year, modeling, well, what does today's weather patterns look like? What are the fuel conditions doing? Is it really dry in a certain area? Is it really windy in a certain area? It's that hot, dry, windy combination that creates the fire risk. And that's a short-term view where I'm only forecasting out 5 days, but that's everywhere across the service territory. So between that long-term view and that short-term view, I'm able to identify that risk anywhere across our service territory any day of the year. And so that allows us, with those two different views, two different models, to be able to identify that risk and not be surprised. And so what I mean by that is if you only had a long-term risk view, the seasonal outlook, say it's a drier year than normal, might not show up on a 30-year view of what's going on this year. But when I use the short-term view, I'm going to get what this year's doing weighted a lot more. And so that risk will come to the top a lot sooner on the short-term risk modeling. So that's why we want to look at both. And once we've done that, we've identified the risk. Anywhere across our service territory, we've identified the risk. Well, and that's what leads us to the second category in the middle of the slide there, operational practices. Because if we've identified the risk, that's then going to drive our decision-making of how to operate the system under those conditions. So what do I mean by that? I mean, how do we operate the system? Would include categories like what type of work are we going to do on that day? Do construction crews take different types of equipment out to the job? Are we even going to still do that type of job? Would we do it de-energized? Would we take a water tank out with us on the job? How are we going to restore outages? If an outage occurs under certain conditions, we would maybe require a full patrol of the circuit and re-energize once the full patrol's been done. Or under certain extreme fire risk conditions, we wouldn't patrol at night and we would wait till the next morning where we can get better visual inspection of the full line and feel more confident that restoring doesn't add any additional risk. Operational practices would also include activities like putting the system in a more sensitive protective mode. What I mean by that is when it senses any type of disturbance out on the line, we have relays, we have these devices that can sense that fault and open up the line and de-energize the line that's serving all the households very quickly. And we can change those settings to be even more sensitive so that at any disturbance, it'll open up, create that outage. It does de-energize, and then we can send people out to go see if they can find the trouble, patrol the lines, and then restore when it's determined that it's safe to do so. So we can run in a more sensitive setting depending on the conditions. Operational practices also includes where we would de-energize because there's an active wildfire near our lines. So if you can imagine a fire was started due to lightning and say it's 10 miles away and it's approaching our lines, and at some point it's too close to our system, and for safety, we want to de-energize so that the agencies that are in there fighting the fire don't have to worry about an energized electrical system near that fire, right? And so we just want to remove ourselves from the equation. That's part of operational practices as well. In fact, operational practices is a continuum that as that fire risk escalates, as it goes up, our operational practices and how we respond increases as well. And at the top of that response would be a public safety power shutoff, or a PSPS. And that's where conditions are so extreme. It's at the top 5% of dryness. It's at the top 5% of windy, that it's, you safer to just de-energize the system, allow those conditions to pass through, allow the wind to die down, and then restore the power, right? And so that public safety power shutoff is part of the practice as well. We refer to it as a tool of last resort. It's only when the conditions are at that most extreme level that when we would deploy a public safety power shutoff. But it's in that category as well. And we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So that's how we operate the system, given the risk that's been identified under situational awareness. And that's actually where we see the most risk reduction, because those operational practices can be deployed across our service territory, not just in the areas of the highest fire risk that's been identified, but if that risk is identified anytime throughout the year, we can deploy those operational practices. Then when you go to the far right and you talk about system hardening, this is the part of the wildfire mitigation plan where, for those areas that have been identified as the highest fire risk, the potential for those catastrophic fires, that risk is so high that we look at rebuilding our system. And so what does that look like? That can really be categorized into two main buckets. The first one would be looking at our overhead bare wire. So when you think of the conductor that's going from pole to pole when you look up, and in some areas where you got that bare metal overhead conductor, we want to take that conductor and replace it with a covered conductor. So instead of being bare metal, it's almost like an insulation on top and around, think of like an extension cord. So it's covered with a plastic material. So, and why do we do that? And that's so that if like a tree branch or any kind of object interferes with the conductor, meaning a tree branch is on its way to falling to the ground and it slaps the line, or it goes from line to line between the two conductors, instead of creating an arc or a spark or a fault, now it hits that insulation. It's not hitting the bare metal. No fault is created. So therefore, no spark. And then the tree branch just continues to fall to the ground. And so it reduces that potential for that spark, that fault, that energy to possibly ignite a wildfire, right? So by putting up covered conductor, we reduce that risk. We could also replace that overhead conductor with just undergrounding. So take the line and go undergrounding. And it's a mixture of the two, and we'll talk about it a little bit later when we have a slide on system hardening. But just think that when we do the covered conductor, that's a little less expensive, or quite a bit less expensive than the undergrounding can be, and yet they both reduce the risk significantly. And so it's finding the right mix of those two items to help mitigate the risk of the overhead bare conductor. So that's one aspect of system hardening, and we'll look at how many miles are being targeted and what our progress is on that. The other part of system hardening is installing new devices. When we were in operational practices, I talked about running the system in a more protective mode, a more sensitive mode. And to do that, we can upgrade and install additional devices, relays, line reclosers that provide that capability out on the line. And so it's installation of those new devices, expanding that capability across the system is a part of system hardening as well. What's important to keep in mind when we talk system hardening is those projects are multi-year projects. It takes a couple of years to engineer, design, procure the materials, and actually do the construction, right? And so when you think of system hardening, you got to think of this long-term endeavor of identifying an area, and that's where we use the long-term risk modeling, so that the 30-year view to determine where is that risk that we should be applying multi-year mitigation, multi-year system hardening. And that's where that effort is prioritized. Whereas operational practices is more across the entire service territory, is that available. All right. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of those aspects as we go throughout, but that's generally how a wildfire mitigation plan breaks down: situational awareness, operational practices, and system hardening. Running throughout that is engagement, where we want to make sure we're collaborating with our communities, agencies, our customers, other utilities in the industry, state commissions, and we want to make sure there's good communication and coordination about what Rocky Mountain Power is doing in wildfire mitigation and how we can partner with others for not only what we're doing, but what other agencies can be doing on their side, and make sure we're all on the same page about what we're doing to address wildfire risk. So with that, let's go to the next slide and take a look at the service territory in Utah and what some of those statistics look like. So in Utah, Rocky Mountain Power provides electricity to approximately 1 million customers through over 360 substations, 23,600 miles of distribution lines, and about 7,100 miles of transmission lines across nearly 59,000 square miles in Utah. So across our whole service territories where the system-wide initiatives that I was talking about earlier can be applied. That also includes things like our weather station deployment, the situational awareness, that short-term risk modeling I was talking about, the modified operational practices, the community education and outreach. It's across that entire area. Now, for system hardening, when you look at this Utah service territory, and just to give you a sense of the construction activity that we completed in 2023, Rocky Mountain Power replaced 37 miles of that bare conductor I was discussing earlier with insulated covered conductor. And we replaced 11 miles of bare conductor with underground conductor. So that right mix of what should be covered conductor and what should be undergrounded. And we upgraded over 60 reclosers, relays, and circuit breakers as well last year. And that's referring to those devices that can have the more sensitive settings that open up the line very quickly, de-energize if any disturbance, if a fault condition is sensed, is detected out on the line. All right, the next slide now is going to break down that same service territory, but look at which areas of the service territory have been identified as having that high risk I talked about, that long-term view. When we do that risk modeling, where we take historical wildfires, historical weather patterns, we look at the terrain, we look at the population density, and if I run that through the model, which areas have that highest potential for catastrophic fire, or what areas would have the highest impact from a wildfire, right? And so using and implementing those modeling tools to support the, like what does the location specific risk look like to help inform that, we've identified these geographic areas that have that heightened risk. So on the map, it's called, you see the Fire High Consequence Area, or FHCA. That's our acronym. That's what we call those areas that have been identified as the high risk. So that FHCA, it's shown as purple on the map, and that's approximately 11% of Rocky Mountain Power service territory in Utah is now in one of these areas of heightened risk. And in those areas, then, We prioritize the system hardening that I talked about earlier. We also target in those areas expanded, enhanced vegetation management and increase our inspections of our poles and wires in those areas. Uh, we really want to make sure that in those areas that we get eyes on those lines, annually, so that we understand the conditions of those assets in those high risk areas. If anything is found that needs to be resolved, that it's resolved quickly, that any conditions are fixed, and that the assets are in good working order, being ready to go into fire season or those high risk conditions, right? And so that's where those areas have been identified across our service territory. And I just want to reiterate that while we've identified those areas and some programs are prioritized to those areas, we still have a holistic wildfire mitigation plan that has those operational practices in place across the entire service territory. So even though just this 11% has been identified, the wildfire mitigation plan is in place for the entire service territory. All right, so if we go to the next slide, we get a little bit more information on that situational awareness I was talking about, as far as how we do that. And I'm going to talk now about the short-term risk modeling. So the dynamic risk assessment that's done through situational awareness and weather forecasting that can be done anywhere across the service territory and is done everywhere across the service territory every day of the year. And so fire season's not really a start and an end. It's about analyzing and having this situational awareness every day of the year, right? And so our approach to situational awareness includes the collection of a tremendous amount of data. And that's either coming from our own utility-owned weather stations, or taking in data that's available from other data sources, right? We take in all that information to forecast and assess the risk and inform real-time decision-making about how we're going to operate the system. In terms of the network that we own, Rocky Mountain Power has installed 121 weather stations that collect and provide data to our meteorologist team internal, and models that information or collects that information from those weather stations every 10 minutes. And it's all to support that modeling and decision making, right? We continue to build out that weather station network throughout Utah with a goal of having near 169 operational stations by the end of 2027. And that's all to help us just comprehensively evaluate all the data, evaluate the risk modeling across the entire service territory. You might be asking, well, why don't you just go install all the weather stations right now? Well, when you model it, you install a large amount of weather stations like we've done, 121. You do the modeling, you figure out where the gaps are from the modeling, and then you refine that model as you go forward with additional weather stations that fill in what gaps you're seeing in the model and being able to forecast accurately the weather. And so you only can find those gaps as you run the model, as you collect the information, and as you get experience. And so that's why it's over a number of years that weather station continues to be built out. So we've built it out a lot, but then we continue to refine it as we go forward. I did mention our meteorology team, right, that we have internal. I just want to emphasize that again, that we brought that skill set internal to Rocky Mountain Power. We've hired 6 full-time meteorologists who provide that daily event-driven forecast that informs all of our decision-making up to including public safety power shutoff, right? And so that's an internal department we've formed, and we now have that skill set internal to the company. In addition to the weather station network, we also continue to pilot and get experience with cameras, wildfire detection cameras. Now, these are cameras that have a nice view of various areas where they have AI on the camera that can detect smoke plumes right from a long distance away and be able to alert not only us but the fire agencies so that response is that much quicker. So it's all part of a comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan where obviously our goal is to prevent any type of ignition. But if ignition was to occur for any reason, we want to make sure that the response is very rapid. And so piloting and trying to expand our wildfire detection camera network is part of that as well. Now, when it comes to the weather stations and building out the 121 weather stations and on our way to 169, we also provide that data that from those weather stations to the public. You can go on to RockyMountainPowerWeather.com. You see the address there on the slide, and you can see all the weather stations and their current readings and the trend and what's been going on for the last period of time. So we make that data available to others outside of the company as well. All right, as we go to the next slide, we'll get into that, taking that information from the weather station network, taking that information as far as where's the risk today, where's the risk tomorrow, and then based on that, putting our system in a more sensitive setting, right? I talked about that earlier. It's basically our response escalates as the conditions escalate. So this graphic, what I want you to take away from this slide, right, is that as the fire risk escalates, so does our response. And so as the fire risk goes from this slide where like a dark green, think of like wintertime, to the far right where it's extreme fire risk, it's the top dry conditions and windy conditions, and that's where the majority of and the probability of catastrophic wildfires is at its highest, right? And so that's where we do the public safety power shutoff potential, right? That's where that exists, where it's like the conditions are so extreme that we evaluate, let's turn the power off, let those conditions pass, and then turn the power back on. But leading up to that, based on the conditions, we can decide when to put our system in that more protective mode. And so we call those enhanced safety settings, putting the system in that sensitive mode. And in the areas that have been identified as the potential for that catastrophic wildfire risk, we want to go into those settings earlier. We basically a safety buffer, right? Between the conditions and that significant fire risk, and we've identified where that cliff's edge is, but I don't want to walk up to the cliff's edge because I know that's where the danger is. I want to make sure I have a nice safety buffer before I get there. And so in those areas of highest risk, we turn those settings on sooner. For the rest of the service territory, we still include a safety buffer, but it's more in the elevated fire risk before significant fire risk, right, is where we're turning those on. So why do we decide to turn those on at different times, right? Is because there's a trade-off between the fire risk that's being mitigated, we're being reduced, and the reliability impact that customers will see. Because as we go into this more sensitive setting, outages that normally would have been a momentary, that tree branch example, slaps the line de-energizes, the tree branch continues to the ground, the line closes back in, the branch is no longer there, so power stays on. It's a very momentary. Maybe it was only 15 seconds, 30 seconds of an outage. Now, under the sensitive settings, the power would remain off. A resource would have to be deployed to that area. They do a patrol, determine it's safe to re-energize, and then re-energize. So from a customer's perspective, the more sensitive settings feels like more outages. It feels like longer duration outages. So we want to make sure that we're deploying that when we need to. We want to have a safety buffer. We don't want to overuse it. We understand there's a reliability impact, but there's also a risk reduction impact. And the balance between the two is what we're trying to achieve. Also, what I'd want you to take away from this slide, you see at the top where it says fire season is a condition, not a date. Rocky Mountain Power is monitoring conditions every day of the year. We've seen in the news different areas of the country that don't normally experience wildfires have experienced wildfires. They've experienced it in wintertime. We don't want to be surprised. And so we take a stance of we're monitoring all the time, everywhere, so that if that risk condition is there, we can respond. When we look back at 2023 and our deployment of these enhanced safety settings, 27% of the overhead circuits in Utah we're operating in that more sensitive setting mode, right? Just to give you a feel of how expansive that operational practice has been deployed and its impact. And so we'll continue on that same path in 2024 and deploy this where it makes sense to mitigate that wildfire risk. All right, let's go to the next slide and look at what some other programs are being modified with this information and this condition-based kind of situational awareness. So let's talk about the underlying programs. And what I mean by that is we have underlying programs of how we maintain the electrical system. It's us getting out and doing inspections, looking at the poles, the wires, the transformers, the equipment, making sure they're in good operating order, going out and doing vegetation management and making sure we have good clearances and hazard trees are being removed. It also includes for vegetation management where we clear the base of from our poles where they're like if there's equipment on the pole, like a transformer, fuses, we go to the base of the pole, clear a 10-foot radius patch around the base of that pole to make sure that if any of the equipment on that pole was to create a spark for any reason, that if those sparks made it to the ground, that there's no vegetation at the base of that pole, right? So between the tree trimming, the hazard tree removal, the pole clearing, vegetation management is really going after that base risk, mitigation for wildfire, in addition to the asset inspections. Now that's, say, programs we've had in place for a long time across our entire service territory. So the change is that in the areas that have been identified for that potential for catastrophic wildfires, we do that activity more often, right? We do those inspections annually. In those areas, we want to make sure we have eyes on those assets more often and that we're resolving conditions quicker because it's those areas that have that highest potential for a catastrophic wildfire. All right, let's go to the next slide and talk more about that system hardening. So in addition to those underlying programs, system hardening, which is prioritized to those fire high consequence areas or FHCA, and it includes those multi-year long-term investments, right? Which for Utah, that represents over $70 million to rebuild those lines, to replace the relays, the reclosers, to install additional devices. So it's a large investment over a long period of time. And that's why we like to emphasize the operational practices because it can be done quicker. It's across our entire service territory, but we recognize there's a longer term investment, number of years to get this system hardening completed. So in terms of power lines, Rocky Mountain Power plans to rebuild over 150 miles in the next few years. As part of the program, these lines may be moved or maybe removed or retrofitted with that covered conductor I talked about earlier, or converted to underground, or some combination of the two, whatever economically makes sense, whatever's appropriate for the access, the area, the risk that we're trying to mitigate. Right now, most of the miles planned have been identified for retrofitting with the covered conductor. But as we evaluate each one of those projects, and as it moves through the project pipeline, we basically try to do a fit for purpose solution for that area of what makes sense. What should be underground, what should be covered conductor. As far as progress, starting in 2022 and continuing into 2023, much of our construction activity was focused on the Salt Lake City, Provo, Cedar City, and St. George areas, where we successfully completed 37 miles of rebuilds. In 2024, we're continuing to implement our program with that same activity, just more of it. Overall, our objective is to complete 60 miles by the end of this year, 60 additional miles by the end of this year. So a lot of activity under system hardening. Okay, as we go to the next slide, we're going to shift gears a bit and we're going to go back to an operational practice. And that's the one that I want to make sure that we understand what it can look like, which is the Public Safety Power Shutoff Program, all right? So for this, Rocky Mountain Power facilitates sessions with public safety partners year-round. And we do that via workshops and outreach events designed to prepare our public safety partners for what a public safety power shutoff or a PSPS would look like. These efforts tend to be front-loaded in the beginning of the year and are coordinated with public safety partners to ensure basically that everyone's on the same page and that expectations have been set before we get into the fire season. That's the goal. So a lot of the activities in the first part of the year as far as what this collaboration and outreach looks like, right? And these include regional workshops, tabletop exercises that are just tailored to make sure that we have good coordination and collaboration. We collaborate with community organizations. We attend, conferences, town halls, other events, safety fairs, multi-day functional exercises that might be going on in various counties, communities. Some of them there are events, and we invite others to our tabletop exercises, right? And that's just all to make sure that we've had good conversations before we get into the event. That will make the event that much smoother if and when we get there, that the coordination, the planning has been conducted beforehand, right? As I said earlier when I was talking about public safety power shutoffs, it's a tool of last resort, meaning it's when the conditions are so extreme, that top 5% of dryness, that top 5% wind, right? That's when we want to use a public safety power shutoff. We understand that turning the power off to a community has an impact. It has an impact to agencies who might be trying to respond to an event, put out an active wildfire. And that's why at the core of our decision making is our overall, balancing the risk and the conditions that surround the fire risk with the risk that surrounds the de-energization itself. And we want to make sure that we're communicating and working with our partners, that all of that feedback is taken into account leading up to the decision to conduct a public safety power shutoff. So that's all part of the decision making. You see on the screen the basic kind of process or sequence of what a PSPS would look like. And it involves notifications, that decision making leading up to the event, when we de-energize. As we're doing our patrols during the event, the conditions have gone down, our final restoration, and we notify customers, and we basically a final notification when the event's over. Making sure everyone's communicated to very well throughout the entire event, right? We also provide resources during the de-energization, right, with community resource centers. And that's in coordination with public safety partners, communities, and basically setting up a shelter that can provide services to customers and community members, such as on-site medical support, air conditioning, refrigeration, internet, phone access, charging your devices. Providing these services to customers when they don't have power at their home and providing them a location to go to, right? Rocky Mountain Power also performs individual outreach to customers with medical needs in preparation for and during PSPS events. So this additional outreach can come in the form of an individual personal phone call where Rocky Mountain Power employee personally calls an individual, a customer with a medical need, and make sure that they are aware of the public safety power shutoff and that their needs are being taken care of and addressed, and helping them if they need any assistance. If we can't get a hold of them on the phone, then it's about physically visiting each of the customers' homes and making sure they're okay. And we do that either leveraging our own resources or working with our public safety partners to make sure that physical visit occurs. To ensure this additional notification can be performed, we ask that customers, to the extent that they're comfortable in doing so, that they self-identify with us and enroll in our medical program. That's basically giving us a call and letting us know that you're a medical customer so that we can get you flagged in our system, so that if a public safety power shutoff was to occur in your area, that you would be on the list to perform the additional notification. So let's talk about the Public Safety Partner Portal. All right. And now this is where we recognize that when we're in one of these events, a lot of information needs to be exchanged with um, the various agencies, our public safety partners. You think of like telecom or emergency services. And so we have a lot of geographic information that needs to be shared. So we've created a portal that allows our public safety partners to log on and be able to download the critical infrastructure information, the boundary information of what areas are going to be impacted, so that they can take steps on their side of the equation, right? So that if they're the telecom and they were looking at cell towers, and so that they can deploy their backup generation to keep those towers with power during the event. It's about understanding the critical infrastructure in a community. What are the hospitals? Where are the shelters located? Where are the just various emergency services? And are they impacted by the public safety power shutoff or not? And so it allows us to exchange a lot of information quickly through this portal with our various partners. All right. So as we go to the next slide, we'll transition to how can you be prepared for a public safety power shutoff? And so here are some of the steps you can do. And so the first step I already mentioned, which is make sure you update and verify your contact information with the company. We want to make sure that if you are one of those medical customers, that if you feel comfortable doing so, you've self-identified so that you're registered in our system. You can call us, or you can go on the RockyMountainPower.net website and log on to your online account that way as well. For your property, look at step 2, which is create that defensible space. So if you think of like, well, what does your property look like as far as being able to create that buffer between a wildfire that might be approaching your property and the structures on your property? And paying attention to what defensible space do you have around your house, your structures, that can dramatically reduce fire risk as well on your property. Step 3, always good advice for either a wildfire event or any type of emergency event, which is have a plan. Update your emergency plan and supplies. Do you have what you need at your house to get through either a wildfire event, where maybe it's a public safety power shutoff, a normal outage, or even a winter storm? Make sure you have a good emergency plan. All right. The next slide is going to emphasize again about the medical programs we have and making sure that if you're one of these customers or someone in your household that uses some type of medical equipment, medical devices, that you're concerned about the impact of a power outage, is that go to our website, make sure you identify as a medical program customer so that we know to notify you, but can also get information about um, battery backup or generators, and if you're impacted by the outages from a medical point of view, kind of steps you can take, and making sure that you're registered with us if you feel comfortable doing so helps with the notification process so that we can assist you in an event as well. All right, let's go to the last slide, which is our community outreach and education. So in addition to the investments I talked about, where we invest in our meteorology department, we invest in our risk modeling across the entire service territory every day of the year. We invest in our operation protocols. We invest in the system hardening, in our customer programs. Rocky Mountain Power takes a multi-pronged approach throughout the year to ensure wildfire preparedness and education to our customers and communities is completed as well. And so we facilitate collaboration such as the tabletop exercises with our public safety partners that I was talking about earlier, with our community-based organizations, where we work with our partners to prepare for the potential for a public safety power shutoff event or other emergencies. It's a good conversation for any emergency or event throughout the year. We also work to get key information out to our communities we serve via social media and/or like radio campaigns, brochures, and flyers, a few of which you can see examples on this slide. We also host webinars like the one we're having today. These efforts tend to be, again, front front loaded in the year to ensure everyone is prepared for the upcoming fire season. But really throughout the year, we maintain additional information on our website, which you can see here on the screen. If you go to rockymountainpower.net to get additional information, you can get the wildfire mitigation plan, you can log on to your account. So we encourage you to go to the web page as well to get additional information, right? There's a lot of information on our website for you as well. So with that takes us to the last slide, which is just a thank you slide. I know I covered a lot of information very quickly. The goal is to give you an overview of everything that Rocky Mountain Power is doing in Utah for wildfire mitigation. There's a lot of components to it. There's a lot of nuances to it. It's far-reaching in its scope. It's a multi-year endeavor. It does represent a large investment, and it's about identifying that wildfire risk and making sure we have mitigation plans in place to reduce that risk as much as possible, balancing out the impact to customers with reliability or the impact of having a de-energization in a community. And that really is the overall objective of the wildfire mitigation plan, is keeping our communities, customers safe. So with that, Simon, I turn it back over to you to see if there's any Q&A that we can address.